I want to begin by reading to you a story from our global partners in Southeast Asia. Vandana is a woman who lives in a small, impoverished village in Bangladesh. Her village is on the southern part of Bangladesh and lies right at the coast of the Bay of Bengal. Vandana's family has been there for generations, farming and fishing. Her husband and her eldest son are day laborers on a fishing boat, while she farms their small plot of land, and her two younger sons attend school. 2 years ago, there was a strong typhoon that destroyed the embankment that was protecting the village from daily tides. The local government rebuilt the embankment, but they rebuilt it farther inland and left Vandana's entire village outside of the embankment, so their homes wouldn't be, that left them vulnerable to high tides twice a day. The village moved to a higher ground outside the embankment so their homes wouldn't be flooded. However, the land the villagers used for farming, the flat area, was still flooded twice a day with salt water, and no one can grow crops there anymore. Vandana must now buy vegetables from the market with this little money her husband and her son earn from working on the fishing boat as day laborers. The government promised to relocate the village to land outside the embankment, but they've not done so yet. The houses built after the typhoon are temporary, and they won't stand up to another strong typhoon, which are becoming more frequent because of climate change. They'll have to spend their meager savings when that happens on rebuilding a house, rather than buying food or sending their two younger sons to school. Vandana's family is one of the poorest of the poor around the world. Her family used to be able to survive on what they could grow and from what they could fish. But now, with no land to grow food, her family is at greater risk for starvation, for malnutrition, and for the very vulnerable to the whims of weather. The past decade in Southeast Asia was the hottest on record. Weather events like hurricanes and typhoons become more severe. Droughts and wildfires are destroying whole animal species, along with killing people and destroying homes. Sea levels are rising, threatening island communities with displacement. Climate change affects the entire world, but most acutely affects the most vulnerable people and communities. Those most affected by climate change are the ones who contributed the least to the problem, and the ones who have the fewest resources to adapt. As sea levels rise, salt water leaches into the ground. Strong storms bring destructive winds that destroy structures and erode coastlines. Science has determined that we're now at a point of reaching no return. We can't get back to the way things used to be, but we can stop where we are. The problem is we have to act now. Political will is lacking in most developed countries that have the power to do anything, including our own. The question Global Ministries asks that struck me is, what would it look like if we took climate change as seriously as we took the COVID pandemic? What would it look like if we had taken as a world that seriously? The scriptures today are crystal clear. This planet we live on was wonderfully and beautifully and intentionally created. God said in the first book, the tradition tells us, have dominion over the earth and subdue it. Dominion is the word for lordship, right? When Peter kneels before Jesus, he says, Dominus et Deus, Dominus, Lord, dominion, to have lordship over the earth. But lordship does not mean domination in a negative sense. Unfortunately, we think it is because many of our leaders have been negative. But the best leaders are benevolent ones, aren't they? The best leaders are those who care for the best good of the people they serve. And so being in dominion over the earth means that we're stewards. Oftentimes we've forgotten that our job is to protect and to cultivate, not to use and destroy for our own good. But if we're honest, our own selfish consumption is our worst enemy. The old adage stands true. 80% of the world uses 20% of the world's resources. 20% of the world uses 80% of the world's resources. Guess which part we are in as Americans? We're in the 20% that uses 80% of the resources. We're the first world. It's our throwaway culture. It's our overconsumption. It's our need for convenience. They all lead to an economic crisis that affects the poorest among us. In the 1980s, Reverend Dr. Ben Chavis of the United Church of Christ coined the phrase that has now become part and parcel of social justice. That phrase was environmental racism. How can the environment be racist? It's not. But environmental racism means that our environmental practices, our environmental laws, our environmental protections or lack thereof are often reflective of our own understanding of race and class. Case in point, when I say Flint, Michigan, what do you think of? Water crisis, right? From the last couple of years. Let me be very clear with you. The water crisis in Flint, Michigan would not have happened. It would not have been allowed to happen. People would have risen up and overthrown things and raised money and pitched a fit and politically rallied until it changed if Flint had been richer and whiter. That's environmental racism. Pollution in Appalachia. Some of the poorest of the poor of our nation live not too far from where we are. It wouldn't happen if the poor could afford proper legal recourses to the companies that are dumping in their area. But what choice do they have but to put up with what life has given them? A movie a few years ago, Aaron Brockovich, maybe you've seen it, showed the story of a woman who fought Pacific Gas and Electric because it was polluting the water and the land, and high cancer rates were the result of the lack of care and the carelessness and the greed of corporate America. Right now in Southeast Asia, the Hindu religion believes, and we talked about this a few weeks ago with the dukkha, the caste system, the ritual understanding of human waste and ritual impurity. That human waste and animal waste and animal death make you not just dirty, but ritualistically impure. The same as it did in Bible times, which is why, of course, we have the Good Samaritan story we read a few weeks ago. The caste system set up the dukkha, the lowest, because they're the ones who deal with human waste. They're ritualistically impure. But what that means is the rest of society is not able to deal with human waste without being ritualistically impure, which leads to water contamination and soil contamination and typhus and other other horrible diseases. The church then responds. How? If you go to our global ministries page and you look at volunteer opportunities, you see all sorts of listings for volunteer missionaries to go. And it's not to go and save souls and tell them about Jesus. It's to go and do HIV and AIDS education. It's to go and do education for women who've been sexually trafficked. And it's also to go and teach communities about safe hygiene and water practices and to go and dig wells for communities that don't have access to clean water, both in Southeast Asia and in Africa as well. The church responds with education about hygiene for safe water practices, about water treatment education and agricultural education for best production practices, as we saw in the video. Money for digging wells for poor villages that don't have access to clean water. Yes, entire villages don't have access to clean water. And we take that for such granted here, don't we? What steps can we take then as a church to lessen greenhouse emissions and its effects on people like Vandana and others who live in poverty in the world? In 2018, I read that 85% of rural access 85% of the world's rural access had access to clean water. 85%. That's up 8.9% since 2005. That's great progress. 85% of this area has access now to clean water in rural areas. 80% of those living in cities. 64% of those living in rural areas in Southeast Asia have access to flushing toilets and piped sewage lines. 64%. That means that literally 1 in 3 people who live in rural areas of Southeast Asia have access to sewage pipes and flush toilets. Can you imagine not having that? This is the reality in the part of the world we're talking about. And we could say the same thing about Africa. We could see the same thing about villages and parts of South America. What steps can we take in our own homes? The old adage that we don't like to hear: recycle, reuse, and reduce. Recycle, reuse, and reduce. Do you realize that styrofoam cups, just simple styrofoam cups, are the largest purveyor of toxic gases in the universe that destroy our ozone layer? Just switching to paper cups makes a difference. Better yet, wash a glass. This is a moral issue. It's an injustice. It's a sin against God. It's a sin against creation. And it's a sin against the most vulnerable people of our world who don't have the resources, don't have the money, don't have the political power to have a voice to speak for themselves. And so we have to speak for our neighbors who live in abject poverty. We can make a difference. Whether or not we will make a difference, whether or not we'll be inconvenienced to make a difference, it doesn't say something just about our physical ability to. It says something about our moral and our spiritual ability as well. Amen.